Hello, everyone. Once again, this is Pastor Terry Reese of the Valley Grace Brethren Church of Armagh, Pennsylvania. As always, we deem it a very high privilege to have you with us for this time of study and reflection. We deeply appreciate the fact that you are granting us some of your valuable time in order to grow in God's Word. And we trust that the time you invest here will be meaningful. We are continuing where we left off last week. Of course, we're in this broader series which deals with the sanctity of human life, which in turn is part of a greater series dealing with the historic Grace Brethren Statement of Faith. And we've been talking about the doctrine of man, and that got us into this series within a series dealing with the sanctity of human life. You know, we are all created in the image and likeness of God. Yes, that image and likeness has been distorted as a result of the fall, but nonetheless, it remains. And last week we started talking about a great evil under the sun, in which we see human beings being exploited and debased. And that evil deals with the oppression of overreaching government and political tyranny. This is a thing that we observed, friends, is hateful unto God, especially when we deal with the attending evil of the violation of the human conscience. When government dares to curtail the free expression of man's spiritual life. We see this over and over again in the scriptures. For example, Daniel chapter 3, a classic example, when the three holy children, as they're sometimes called, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these faithful young Jews in Babylon, when they refused to bow down to this absurd 90-foot tall gold-plated image that King Nebuchadnezzar had erected, and they refused to bow down and worship this image. Of course, from Nebuchadnezzar's perspective, this was all very political. Religion being used to serve the interests of the almighty state. You see this absolute fusion over church and state, and thus you see the state attempting to exert totalitarian control over man's spiritual life. This is what happens when the state becomes God. And these three young men, these three valiant heroes of the faith, they refused to bow down to that image, and thus were cast into the fiery furnace. Again, we see the same thing going on in Daniel chapter 6. When Daniel, following the Davidic precedent of having three set prayer times before God during the day, devotional times where he would pray unto God, when the state, under Persian control at that time, sought to obstruct his worship and demanded that citizens could only pray to the king, Darius the Mede. This resulted in Daniel being cast into the lion's den. Of course, we see our Lord Jesus Christ, his dim view of this sort of behavior, best expressed in Matthew chapter 22, verse 21. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And of course, the implications are that Caesar is not entitled to be in control of our spiritual lives. He is not entitled to bind our consciences. We're going to get we're going to get deeper into that verse in a moment. But this matter of human tyranny, as we observed last time. And by the way, I would certainly recommend that you, if you haven't, that you see the first part of this message where we lay out the problem and how God is disgusted by political tyranny. That message on YouTube, Internet Archive, on Rumble. We do invite you to check out that message and share it or click like. But we observed last time that human tyranny has always been with us. Whether we're dealing with the early post-flood civilization at Babel, where you saw this early empire established by Nimrod, which held sway over Babel, that terrible civilization described in Genesis chapter 11. And then dealing with the civilizations, the early cradles of civilization that emerged out of Babel. After Babel, men dispersed upon the face of the earth. They filled the earth as God had originally commanded them. They established governments, and of course human government is part of the plan of God to curtail human depravity, to keep us from descending into the type of chaos that existed on this planet before the flood. You may remember that that pre-flood civilization, such as it was, if you can call it a civilization, was noted by its chaos, its violence. Men had covered the earth with violence, and this was contemptible to the Lord. The Lord regretted that he had made man to shed blood upon the face of the earth. So the seed of human government was planted by the Rainbow Covenant, which demanded the lawful execution of murderers, Genesis 9:6. And men had dispersed to various four corners of the earth after their tongues were dispersed at Babel. And you see these early civilizations arise in Egypt, Mesopotamia, ancient China, the ancient Indus Valley, India, all about the same time. That's interesting, isn't it, by the way, friends, that the biblical record of civilization is indeed complements what we know about the rising up of various civilizations. Several thousand years ago, so human civilization arose in various regions about the same time. But sadly, right from the beginning of these civilizations, in these early cradles of civilization, we see political tyranny arise. We see the political exploitation and debasement of human beings. We see the rise of so-called god kings in Egypt. You know, this is why the pharaohs married their sisters, and you had such incest in that civilization, because the kings claimed to be semi-divine beings, descendants of Amun-Ra, the sun god. Early Mesopotamia, the same thing. These god kings claiming divinity for themselves. And ancient China, the same thing. The imperial sons of heaven rising up in the early Shang dynasty. And this is the nature of man. The state becomes God, and tyranny follows. And of course, as we observed last time, we're not progressing towards anything except Armageddon, except to worldwide slavery, Revelation 13. The fact is, the modern police states of our time are just as horrific as Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon ever was in its heyday. These modern totalitarian party states that have these isms, socialism, communism, fascism, these secular religions that are utterly godless and seek to control the total existence of man. Thus, they are totalitarian in nature. We observed last time that, yes, human government is ordained of God. It is, shall we say, a necessary evil because of the fall. We need a stern magistrate, Romans 13:4, Genesis 9:6, to preserve social order, The Lord has not placed the sword in the king's hand in vain. There's a reason for this. And we see this in our contemporary society, which is becoming more and more lawless in this country. Our big cities are dangerous, wicked places. And this is why it's necessary to have a government. It would be nice if we could have a pure libertarian chaos, but we can't. If you would remove the government, all you would have would be roving gangs, which through force would be terrorizing the weak and the elderly and everybody else. And you would have clan violence, sort of like the era before the flood. It would be absolute chaos. Friends, God is a God of order, 1 Corinthians 14:33, and that's why we need the state. However, understanding that human government is indeed ordained of God, created by God, nonetheless, this particular expression of human government that we've seen since the fall is not in accordance with the will of God. Anything that man touches, he corrupts. This exploitative, degrading, oppressive tyranny, the government by the jackboot, that's not in the will of God. This oppressive tyranny that we see today. We think about this fact that the Lord has declared this to be an abomination. Proverbs 16:12. It is an abomination. That's a heavy word, isn't it? It is an abomination for kings to commit wicked acts, for a throne is established on righteousness. You know, friends, that is what the Lord is calling the rulers of this age to, and they're failing. And they're failing miserably, and they're going to continue to fail. How we need the return of the Lord Jesus Christ to bring us good government, the government that we've longed for. Last time, again, I invite you to turn to that message. We reviewed the long, dark past. We also looked at the sadness of the present evil age, what the present state of the planet is, and it's not a good one. And we've looked at the ominous future, the reign of Antichrist, which will be the ultimate fruition of human culture, the other debasement of human culture, and that awaits. That's the thing that progressive modern man will bring us. World government, world religion, a one-world economy, a one-world tyranny, oppressive tyranny like the world has never seen. That is man's dark future left to his own devices. Human government is ordained of God, but like every other institution created by God, the family, the church, the Commonwealth of Israel, it has been corrupted by human sin. And this is the way of men. Governments who have been assigned to protect end up in a grossly fallen world, only expanding in their power, ultimately oppressing the very people that they were assigned to protect, sucking the very life juices out of a civilization. You know, you think about, again, 1 Samuel 8, which we focused on last time, how Samuel was greatly disturbed by the people's demand for a king, and God told him to warn the people, you want a king, you want to be like the nations, you want to be like the elites of this world, but listen to what the king that you're asking for will do. He will indeed exploit you. He will indeed usurp a godlike authority over you. He will indeed take those things that are most valuable to you, not only your economic prosperity, but indeed your very sons and daughters, and they will become his slaves. And that's what happened. The kings of Israel became oppressors, just like the rulers of the nations. But this is what the people had asked for, wasn't it? Well, We said that particularly obnoxious is the totalitarian state's attempts to regulate the free expression of man's spiritual life. That brings us back to Matthew 22:21. Jesus said, "Therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And we said that was a very revolutionary statement, and it still is. Think about the implications of this. In a world that was used to the idea of absolute fusion of the political and secular spheres, where Caesar controlled religion for his own purposes, Jesus is saying Caesar's not entitled to that. God has given Caesar certain things. He's placed a sword in Caesar's hand, and in order to prevent chaos, to uphold the social order. However, Caesar is not entitled to your spiritual life. And that was a revolutionary statement, and it's still the most radical idea ever uttered. In a planet that is bound in slavery, Jesus is saying that the state does not have the right to exercise totalitarian control, especially when it comes to man's spiritual life, his life of worship, his relationship to God. It should not exercise such control over a man's heart, over a man's mind, over his soul. Here we see, friends, the germ of the idea of limited government. Limited government. Friends, that's an idea, a political idea that our Lord expresses, that it's still too radical for today's politicians. And I'm talking about this country, our contemporary America. I mentioned last time about how you see the struggles in contemporary, progressive, advanced, democratic America that Christian artists have, whether they be cake decorators, whether they be photographers, florists. You see this attempt to curtail our religious conscience by, for example, demanding that such individuals be slaves to the state, and that they cannot act in accordance with the dictates of their conscience when it comes, for example, to refusing to be part of a gay wedding. They can't do this without meeting up with state-sponsored harassment. The fact is, we talk about the fact that we're a democracy, but the fact is, friends, more and more our Constitution is becoming a relic. But that's to be expected. John Adams told us at the very beginning of this constitutional republic that this Constitution that the Founding Fathers, these Christian men or Christian-influenced men, had devised, that this Constitution was meant only for a religious and devout people, for a righteous people. It will not serve the needs of governance for any other sort of people. Now, this is what John Adams, one of our principal founding fathers and our second president, our first vice president, had to say on this issue. In other words, our Constitution is not a perpetual motion machine that will simply keep going in and of itself. This system, this constitutional order that was created in 1787 will not function if in a society that is largely unregenerate. And it's to be expected that as we have lost our national soul, that you will see tyranny rise and rise and rise. That will be the tendency, and it will be the necessary tendency. William Penn, who the founder of my home state, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, stated this: if we will not be governed by God, we must be governed by tyrants. See, he had the same idea that John Adams had. The idea is that such a constitutional order is only suitable to a people who are under the guidance of the Judeo-Christian worldview. It's not suitable for any other people. This matter of United States foreign policy, it applies there. I am not a great fan, I should tell you, of the so-called neocon movement, which is now dominating the foreign policy of both political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. We have this Wilsonian, Bushian kind of idea that it's the holy mission of the United States of America to send its gunboats throughout the world and try to export democracy via force of arms. This stands in marked contrast to the traditional thought of this nation. You remember George Washington. He told us, he bequeathed this to us in his farewell speech. He told us that we should avoid foreign entanglements. I think he understood that when we talk about the United States of America, the reason we speak of it as an exceptional nation is because you had the necessary cultural, religious foundation in place that ultimately gave birth to this constitutional republic that we have. Without that foundation, you can't have such a constitutional order. What's called the old right, the paleoconservatives, like our great president Calvin Coolidge, they understood this, and that's why they had a more humble foreign policy. It's not our duty to go around the world conquering other nations and imposing the American experiment upon them. All that can lead to is forever wars. We impose something on a people, like people in the Middle East, who have been under the sway of Islam and other ideologies, and we expect them to suddenly become good Americans. Friends, you understand that there was a unique historical religious context that gave birth to the United States of America. And it's not even fair to those people to expect them to suddenly become good Americans and understand our historic political ideologies. You know, you think about George W. Bush. He said, who says you can't be Muslim and be free? Well, the thing is this, though. Mr. Bush had this neocon idea that democracies are based upon, quote, shared values, shared universal values. But you see, that's not true. What is true is the old right, paleoconservative perspective that American democracy was born in a unique Judeo-Christian context. We lose that idea, and we have a false view of man. Friends, it has all kind of that's something that has all kind of consequences attached to it, including forever wars, a wild, reckless foreign policy. It just goes to show you, if you don't understand what the Bible teaches about the doctrine of man, the capacity for mischief, political mischief, is bottomless. I think we're inheriting that today. As I said, both political parties seem attracted to this idea of spreading liberal democracy through war, through expanding our influence, through diplomatic means, etc., etc. All right, so we have this problem that we dealt with last time more extensively, what the problem is, and one of the problems that's visiting this earth is tyranny. So then that brings us this week to the first of a two-part message. What can we do about it? What can we do about it? We can complain about it. Oh, the government is godless. Our culture is godless. Even Christians aren't voting in a biblical way and aren't standing on biblical values and are doing nothing basically to have an impact on their society. What can we do about it? Well, first, this week I just want to talk about what we're not called to do. I mean, what we're going to be looking at here next 2 weeks are the perimeters, the wholesome perimeters of Christian citizenship, what we're not called to do, and what we are called to do. We want to look at what is the appropriate response to modern political tyranny by the Bible-believing Christian. First of all, what we're not called to do. I would say, first of all, let's understand this. What we call pietistic indifference, and I'll define that in a moment. Pietistic indifference is not an option. Now, pietism is a religious philosophy, a Christian philosophy that emerged, became very powerful in the early 1700s. You had people like Spener and others who were piggybacking off the influence of the earlier Anabaptist movement, which also had pietistic, kind of nature to it. Pietism is the idea that your focus should be exclusively on the spiritual to the neglect of the temporal. That's sort of my general definition. Perhaps others would not like that definition, particularly pietists, but that's the bottom line as I see it, where you become so heavenly minded that you are no longer of any earthly good whatsoever. Basic problem here, friends, is the Lord hasn't raptured us yet. Okay, we're still here, and we're still called to do good and to love our neighbors. We're still here, and we're still called to be salt and light. The Lord has not sounded the trumpet yet. But I think pietism, this philosophy, has kind of lost that perspective. As I said, the Anabaptists, many of them were attracted by this, and perhaps that's natural because this was an era where you had confusion between the relationship between church and state, where the principle of Jesus in Matthew 22, Caesar has one thing, the church another. That principle, that wholesome principle, was not recognized by the governments of Europe. So perhaps it's natural that our Anabaptist forebears, those of us in the Brethren Church, for example, see ourselves as an extension of the Anabaptist movement. That these radical reformers, as they were called, that we can understand why they went the direction that they did. However, I do think that in many ways they went too far. Early Brethrenism was very much influenced by the pietistic movement, was an expression of that movement, and you see that continuing in early Brethren history amongst the old Brethren, this idea of extreme separation from human affairs. Now, we are called to a type of separation. We're not to enter into any spiritual, underline that, alliances with unbelievers, any kind of spiritual confederacies. That's one of the big problems with today's neo-evangelical movement. They do not practice biblical separation. But this idea of separation from influencing society, being part of the political culture of the society, I see no biblical warrant for that. And that's the direction they went into. They became a separatistic and in many ways fossilized community. You see it today with the Amish, don't you? And some of the old order Mennonite groups entirely cut off from the basic culture. While we might admire from afar that kind of extreme separatism, that's really not what God's calling us to. Yes, we're not to be part of the world, but we're still in the world, and we need to recognize that fact. But it's not just the Anabaptists and certain old order brethren groups. By the way, I have friends that sort of veer close to that old brethren perspective, and I respect them as men of conscience. I disagree with them, but I respect them. And I have friends that are old order Mennonites who have out and out told me, we do not vote. We don't believe that's appropriate, but we do pray for our country. I respect them, but I don't agree with them. It's not just groups like this, though, as I was saying, that hold this kind of perspective, the Anabaptist type groups, but even in some of your neo-evangelical circles, it's very popular. You see somebody like Pastor Gregory Boyd. Now, Gregory Boyd is a megachurch pastor, big church. Of course, he's not even really qualified to be a pastor because he's also subscribes to the doctrine of open theism. He believes that God is not omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent. God doesn't know the future. That's the open theist point of view. He holds that view because he wants to escape the doctrine of divine election, which is a clear biblical doctrine. And the best way to do that is to just say, well, God doesn't even know the future. He doesn't know who's going to be saved. He doesn't know anything. He's an ignorant God. And so we in the modern evangelical culture, more and more we draw comfort from the idea of an ignorant God, a pagan God. And that's why I say he's not qualified to be a pastor. But this word evangelical today, it could mean almost anything now. In Europe, the word evangelical simply means non-Catholic, someone who has a nominal attachment to a Protestant church. That's almost how bad it's getting in this country. It used to be that an evangelical was someone who at least stood for what we call the irreducibles of the faith, such cardinal doctrines as the Trinity, the deity of Christ, what the church has always believed about theology proper, the doctrine of God, namely that God is omniscient, omnipresent, that he is omnipotent, these sorts of things, biblical inerrancy, the doctrine of eternal punishment. But today you can be an evangelical and deny all that stuff. So you see people like Rob Bell, who denies the doctrine of hell, or you see people like Gregory Boyd, who's also called an evangelical, who holds to this open theist view. Boyd, however, more to the point in terms of the perimeters of this discussion, he believes that it is sinful for a Christian to engage in the political culture, for a Christian to become a civic activist, for a Christian to get involved in the messy business of elections and trying to influence the state. His idea, it's a simple-minded idea that what the Christian is called to is total non-involvement in civic affairs. Every government is of Satan. Satan rules the world, and so we should not be involved in that at all. And so he sees little difference between the American constitutional order and the work of people like Washington and Jefferson and Adams and Franklin and Madison and all these giants of our nation, Hancock and Samuel Adams. They're part of the world too. In that sense, there's little difference between them and Adolf Hitler and Hermann Goering and Joseph Stalin and the rest of these secular bums. The idea is that all human government is irredeemably evil and that we should have nothing to do with it. We're too good and holy to have anything to do with secular affairs. Problem with this is, Pastor Boyd, can I ask you a question? Who is it who ordained human government? Okay, it wasn't man's idea. Man apparently was happy to live in chaos before the flood, but it was God's idea. It is God who has placed the sword into the hands of human princes. He has made them his ministers to exercise authority. That's what the message of Romans 13, verses 1 and 2 is. It's God who ordained human government. Are you going to tell me that those whom he has called to be salt and light to this culture, to this blind and dying culture, that we are not to contribute our God-given wisdom, our biblically directed wisdom, to do good unto others? Is that what you're trying to convince me of? Sorry, I'm not convinced. I think some Christians are called to have a strong impact upon secular affairs, to run for office, to advocate for just laws. I think that's a good thing. The second point I would make in terms of things that we are not called to, the Christian is not called to advocate for a lawless anarchy. We already kind of discussed that God indeed has ordained human government, that anarchy will not work. You can't have that kind of absolute freedom in a society. And that therefore, unbiblical forms of unauthorized rebellion, unnatural forms of rebellion are strictly prohibited unto us. That's why our general pattern of behavior should be in accordance with Romans 13, verses 1 and 2. Let me read that passage. Every person is to be, listen, in subjection to the governing authorities. Underline that. Continuing. For there is no authority except from God. And those which exist, he's talking about human princes, are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God. And they that have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 and 15. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to a king as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Okay, so we're not called to advocate for any kind of lawless chaos or become unnatural revolutionaries, and we're not called to be terrorists and just blow things up. Now that doesn't mean that we are called to total blind submission. We'll get into this phrase, be in subjection to the governing authorities, and the other one, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake, to every human institution. There are wholesome limits to that, but in general, we are called to be a peaceful people, and we're certainly not called to lawless rebellion. Number 3, in terms of things we are not called to, we are not called to promote state churches or some sort of theocracy. That's where you have a fusion of church and state, an absolute fusion. There's a big difference between the church having an influence, a righteous influence on the state and upon its princes, and on the other hand, the church and the state being absolutely fused into a single entity, where the church in the end simply becomes an arm of the state. We're not called to that. Christians are sometimes accused of that. Evangelicals are sometimes accused of that by the ACLU and other brain-dead secular organizations. We're sometimes slanderously accused of that when we try to exert some sort of influence on our society. But other than a tiny group called Reconstructionists, I don't see anybody in the modern evangelical world advocating for that. That is a very obscure position. However, it was a problem in the period immediately after the Reformation. Throughout the Middle Ages, you had this fusion between church and state where the Pope would overturn secular princes at will, and when secular princes would be punishing people for what they deemed to be heresy. And when the Reformation occurred, the germ for the separation of church and state was planted, as Luther and others called for men to follow their consciences as dictated by the Scriptures. But the Reformers were men of their age, and they were slow to see sometimes the full implications of their teaching, that means a wholesome separation between church and state. And so a lot of these reform movements became state-church movements. The German states, many of them Lutheranism became the official religion of the state, and the state would punish people who had non-Lutheran ideas. And the same you saw in Geneva with the establishment of a Reformed theocracy, in England an Anglican theocracy. But we're not called to that. Okay? What could be more horrible than having the church and the state absolutely joined together in a modern age such as this? Then you would have the United States Congress deciding the doctrine of our churches. Friends, do you really want horrible people like Nancy Pelosi deciding what your church will be teaching on the local level? Do you really want Chuck Schumer promoting legislation that will determine what will be taught in the pulpit? What could be more horrible for the church than to have a fusion of church and state? All true fundamentalists and conservative evangelicals will oppose such a doctrine, or at least they should. The idea of a state church or a theocracy. Fourthly, another thing we are not called to do in terms of what can we do about this problem, political tyranny, we are not called to total blind submission to the state. Okay, Jesus told us there are certain things we're not to render to Caesar. So that means there's a limitation on what Romans 13 is talking about when it says be in subjection to governing authorities. That means that when 1 Peter 2 talks about submitting yourself to Caesar, there are limitations upon this that in context should be recognized. When you think about total submission to the state, think about the godless direction that can lead to. You may remember the Nazi war crimes trials, the Nuremberg trials, and the defendants there. A lot of them, their defense was they simply were acting in submission to the state. The Führer, he gave the orders, and we followed the orders because you must be in submission to the government. And so therefore, they had a supposed defense for all the horrible things that they did. Obviously, God is not calling us to total blind submission to Caesar. The position of general biblical submission to authority does not negate the idea that there is such a thing as appropriate biblical and civil resistance. Okay, biblical resistance and civil disobedience with regard to our relationship to the state. If the state commands us to engage in, or to endorse, or to promote evil, or by our silence to, in the de facto sense, do all these things, to endorse or promote evil, then we as Christians have a duty to practice resistance, and indeed, if necessary, open civil disobedience. That we cannot act in a manner that is contrary to the clear teachings and wholesome directives of God's Word. We cannot undermine our testimony by making Caesar God. There comes a point where there is, yes, a place for resistance and civil disobedience. We should also recognize, as our founding fathers in America did, that there are some laws that, while they may not directly compel us to sin, nonetheless can serve as dangerous precursors to the same. Certain limitations being placed on human liberty can lead to Caesar having an odious godlike authority over us. Now, I do have on YouTube and Internet Archive a message on this matter of the American Revolution. A lot of times, Christians, and some in my own Grace Brethren Fellowship, have enunciated the idea that our founding fathers of the American Revolution were in sin because they were not in submission to the state in accordance with Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2. Now, I disagree with that position. And by the way, one of the greatest men of our age, Dr. John MacArthur, teaches the same thing, that our founding fathers were in sin. I disagree with that position because the American Revolution was a more complicated affair than many realize. Again, I would invite you, I'm not going to repeat that message. It's there, it's on YouTube, it's on the Internet Archive. I invite you to check it out. Why I do not agree with the idea that our founding fathers, our American founding fathers, were in sin with regard to this issue. But I'll simply underline 5 points here that one should consider. Number one, our founding fathers were Christian men. They took seriously this idea that they were opposing the king. They wrestled with this idea for many years before the rebellion. They, number two, were not anarchists. They did not seek to destroy government in general. They sought rather to reform government. Again, this was a long process in terms of this breaking with Britain. Number three, they saw themselves as law-abiding men, that was their self-image, opposing a government which itself had become lawless, which was not honoring its own common law tradition. Number four, they initially saw this conflict not so much as a revolution, but as a civil war. And later they came to see it as an international war, nation versus nation, that they were opposing another nation, not simply rebelling against a legitimate authority. And number five, they saw themselves as being in submission to the lower magistrates, the colonial governments, whose influence was being improperly curtailed by the higher magistrate, the king, and parliament. So this complicates the whole matter of the American Revolution. So just to say in a superficial manner, our founding fathers rebelled against the king, they were thus not in submission to authority, that it's not quite that simple in this case. But I would invite you to, again, see that message as we lay out the case in favor of our founding fathers. But these are all things, to summarize, that we are not called to do. This is not to be our response to unjust government or to tyrannical government. Just to enumerate these 4 points that we underline today. One, pietistic indifference to what's going on is not an option. We have to respond in some way. We're called to. Number two, we're not called to lawless anarchy, mindless revolution, this kind of thing, an unnatural rebellion. In general, we are to attempt to be in subjection to the governing authorities and be a peaceful, law-abiding people. Number three, we are not called to promote, to overthrow the present order and replace it with a Christian theocracy. That will always be a disaster, and that is never what the church has been called to, even though through many of the Christian centuries, our fathers in the faith did not understand this. Throughout the Middle Ages, that idea was not understood. Throughout late antiquity, that idea was not understood. And through much of the early modern period, that idea was not understood, that you're not supposed to have a state church. It's interesting, when the Roman Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity, he issued an edict of toleration, but he did not make Christianity the state religion. Yes, it became a favored religion, as the emperor felt that it had a favorable influence on the Roman Empire, the decaying Roman Empire. He himself did not make it the state religion, and that was good. Unfortunately, a later emperor, Theodosius, made Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire, and the result was disastrous. And we lived with that disaster for many centuries. And number 4, we're not called to total blind submission to the state, where the state, we end up like the world, where the state essentially becomes our God, just like it is for the world. There is a place for resistance, biblical resistance, a biblical form of resistance, and for civil disobedience, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, practitioners of righteous civil disobedience. They resisted Caesar when Caesar wanted something rendered to him that didn't belong to him. Well, that's what we're not to do. And I think we'll do well if we don't do those things. Next week, I want to pick up on what we are called to do. What options, thus, therefore, are open to us as believers as we seek to serve God in these last days. Well, until next time, friends, this is Pastor Terry Reese. May the Lord be with you.